My name is Laura Bennett. I'm 32 years old. And last month I learned the hardest truth about family. Sometimes the people who raised you will demand a sacrifice not out of love, but out of convenience. And the strongest response isn't shouting, it's paperwork. You know that sting when someone calls you selfish for holding on to something you earned? That's the label my parents pinned on me the morning they walked into my kitchen and told me point blank. Sell the Lakewood cabin to your sister Rachel, or you're no longer our daughter. Imagine that, your own parents standing there with arms crossed like prosecutors, deciding that your value as a child depends on handing over a house that represents every ounce of independence you've worked for. They didn't come with a soft suggestion. They came with a realtor's folder, listing sheets already printed, and a speech rehearsed. But here's the twist they didn't see coming. 3 days earlier, I had already taken a step that would flip their ultimatum upside down. And when Rachel's husband Mark, the man they practically worship, found out, his reaction made my father drop his coffee. Before I tell you how that happened, I want to pause for a second. If stories like this resonate, hit like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, are you watching this late at night, or is it your morning coffee break right now? Now let me take you back, because to really understand why this house became a battlefield, you need to know what it was like growing up as the other daughter in the Bennett family. Rachel was the princess, plain and simple. From kindergarten on, she got the front row attention. When I brought home straight A's, the response was a polite nod. When Rachel managed a B in art class, Mom threw a celebration with balloons. I remember one Christmas when I was 10. I had saved allowance to buy Dad a leather wallet. He opened it, smiled for half a second, and set it aside. Then Rachel handed over a construction paper card with glitter glued on, and suddenly it was the highlight of the evening. Dad called it thoughtful and creative. I sat there, my wallet gift half buried under wrapping paper, wondering what more I had to do. Birthdays? Rachel got parties with pony rides, I got sheet cake in the dining room. School events? They never missed hers. But when I had my solo in the choir, Mom arrived late and Dad didn't show at all. If you're wondering how a kid survives that kind of imbalance, the answer is you look for the one adult who sees you. For me, that was Grandpa Henry. He was rough around the edges, worked his whole life at the steel plant, but he had this quiet way of noticing details. Laura, he'd say, you've got grit. Grit gets you through when applause doesn't come. I still remember the smell of his pipe tobacco, the creak of his porch swing, and the way he made space for me to just be. He took me fishing at Lakewood every summer, long before the cabin became mine. He'd hand me the oars and say, "Steady strokes, kiddo. Don't let the current push you where you don't want to go." At the time, it sounded like fishing advice. Later, I realized it was life advice. Fast forward 20 years, and that same cabin, the place where I learned to row, where I studied for finals, where I patched the roof shingles one brutal summer with my own 2 hands, was suddenly in my name. Grandpa left it to me in his will. He knew I'd take care of it. He also knew, I think, that my parents would try to hand it over to Rachel if he left it to the family. When the papers arrived, I cried. Not just because of the gift, but because it was the first time someone in this family chose me. My parents' smiles lasted about 2 seconds before they shifted into strategy mode. Rachel and Mark could use that place for starting a family, Mom said. You're single. You don't need all that space. Dad chimed in. Be reasonable. Family property should benefit the child who's moving forward. Moving forward. That was their way of saying Rachel mattered more. What they didn't know was that the cabin wasn't just an old house by the lake. It was appraised at $600,000, with developers already sniffing around to turn lakeside lots into luxury rentals. Mark, Rachel's husband, works in real estate. The sparkle in his eyes when he mentioned potential told me everything. They didn't just want a family retreat. They wanted a flip. That's when the pressure campaign started. Calls at midnight. Group texts about doing the right thing. Even guilt trips about how Grandpa would have wanted us united. Truth is, Grandpa wanted me protected, and I wasn't about to let their voices bulldoze his gift. So when my parents marched in with their ultimatum, sell or be disowned, I felt anger, yes, but also a strange calm. Because tucked inside my desk drawer, already stamped and recorded, was a leaseback contract and a right of first refusal agreement that meant no one could force me out, without my say. They had no idea, and as I looked at Rachel's tear-streaked face and Mark's confident smirk, I thought to myself, you all think I'm the weak one. You have no idea who you're dealing with. And then Mark leaned forward across the table, tapped the realtor's folder and said, we can wrap this up in a week, Laura. Just sign. I didn't move, because 3 days earlier her husband had already. The official letter came on a gray Tuesday morning, tucked between utility bills and a grocery flyer, and I almost dropped my coffee when I saw the law firm's seal. It was Grandpa Henry's estate paperwork, and there in black ink was my name listed as sole beneficiary of the Lakewood cabin. For a moment I just sat at my kitchen table, staring at those words, letting the weight of them settle. It wasn't about the dollar figure, though I knew that cabin was worth nearly $600,000 on today's market. It was about memory, about summers with sunburned shoulders, the creak of the dock under bare feet, the scent of cedar mixed with pipe smoke. That cabin was the only place I ever felt chosen, the one sanctuary where I wasn't second to Rachel. I thought maybe finally my parents would see me differently. I was wrong. Within days, the calls started. First, it was Mom, soft-voiced. Honey, we should talk about the cabin. Rachel and Mark could really use it to start their family. Then Dad with his pragmatic edge. It's just practical, Laura. You don't need a whole property sitting empty. Be smart. I tried to explain. This wasn't just real estate, it was history, a piece of Grandpa's soul. They brushed it off as sentimentality. By the end of the week, the group texts lit up like a siren. Rachel chimed in with emojis and long paragraphs about family unity and what Grandpa would have wanted. Every ding of my phone felt like another jab. Don't be selfish. Do the right thing. We'll all benefit. I muted the chat, but the silence didn't last. They showed up unannounced on Sunday, standing on my porch like a delegation. Dad with folded arms, Mom with tissues ready, Rachel with Mark right behind her, his hand on her shoulder like he was the director of this performance. Laura, Mom began, we love you, but think of the bigger picture. A home is meant to nurture a family, and Rachel has one now. You're single. You can always buy another place someday. The words cut deeper than they probably realized. I wanted to shout that being unmarried didn't make me less worthy, that the cabin was my home, even if it wasn't filled with children yet. But before I could, Mark stepped forward. He wore that polished investor smile, the kind that tries to sell you something while making you feel like it's your own idea. I've already spoken with a couple of contacts, he said casually. Developers would jump at that property. We could flip it, triple the value, maybe even split profits down the line. Everyone wins. There it was, the real motive. It wasn't about family memories or Rachel's so-called future. It was about a payday. My stomach turned. I told them no, firmly. The porch felt smaller with every breath, their faces crowding in, disappointment sharpening into frustration. Dad warned me I was making a mistake. Rachel's eyes welled up, whispering about how I was tearing us apart. Mark just smirked, like a man who already had the upper hand. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to the buzz of my muted phone. Dozens of unread texts stacked up. Accusations, guilt trips, even thinly veiled threats about being cut off. Truth is, I'd been cut off emotionally my whole life. Still, it hurt. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again, a different tone. A message from an unknown number. This is Mark. I know you're stubborn, but we can make this easy. Let's talk before the others complicate things. My heart pounded. Why was he contacting me directly in secret? And why did it sound like he'd already moved pieces on the board before I even knew the game had started? By the following Saturday, the confrontation I had dreaded became reality. I came home from a grocery run to find 3 cars in my driveway and a stranger in a tailored blazer flipping through papers on my porch. Inside, my parents sat at my dining table with Rachel perched on the edge of a chair like royalty, and Mark leaned casually against the wall as if he owned the place already. The stranger introduced herself as a realtor, hired to make the process smooth. I set the grocery bags down and just stared, the audacity almost laughable. Mom jumped in with her rehearsed kindness. Sweetheart, we thought it would be best to get things moving. The market is hot right now. This offer is above appraisal. She slid a folder across the table, numbers highlighted in yellow. Dad added his signature firmness. This is fair, Laura. More than fair. Sign today, and you'll have cash in your account by Friday. Otherwise, well, you know where we stand. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage contained. I pulled out a chair, sat down slowly, and looked at each of them in turn. Rachel avoided my eyes, fiddling with her phone. Mark smirked, confident, the kind of confidence that comes from thinking you've already cornered someone. For a moment, I let the silence stretch until the ticking of the wall clock filled the room. Then I reached into my tote bag and placed a thick folder on the table. Their eyes followed it like cats watching prey. "You want to talk paperwork?" I said quietly. "Let's talk paperwork." I opened the folder, revealing stamped documents, notarized signatures, official seals. 3 days ago, I executed a leaseback agreement with a 5-year term. I also recorded a right of first refusal with the county clerk. That means this property cannot be sold, transferred, or reassigned to anyone else without my explicit consent. Even if I walked away today, no deal can happen without me. The realtor blinked, clearly uncomfortable. Dad's face flushed crimson. "What the hell did you do?" he barked. Mom's voice pitched high. "Laura, how could you go behind our backs like this?" I almost laughed at the irony. Behind their backs? They had marched a realtor into my house without even telling me. Rachel finally looked up, her expression torn between shock and embarrassment. But it was Mark who broke the tension. He pushed off the wall, walked to the table, and with calculated calm picked up one of the documents. He skimmed it, then set it down gently like a teacher with a student's homework. "Impressive," he said. "Really, Laura, you've done your research. But here's the thing." He leaned closer, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. "These agreements don't change what's already in motion. You think you're ahead, but you're playing checkers while I'm playing chess." Dad, emboldened by Mark's tone, slammed his palm on the table. "We will not let you torpedo this family over sentimentality." The room vibrated with his anger. Mom dabbed her eyes dramatically. Rachel whispered my name, pleading, but I kept my eyes on Mark. Because in that moment, his smirk faltered just enough to reveal something else. He knew more than he was saying. "What do you mean already in motion?" I asked, steady. He straightened, buttoned his jacket, and smiled again, that investor smile that hides knives. "Let's just say," he replied, "you might not be the only one with documents at the clerk's office." My chest tightened. A cold wave of realization hit me. Mark had already filed something. Maybe a lien, maybe a preliminary contract, maybe worse. My parents looked confused. Rachel looked anxious. But I knew exactly what his words meant. The battle wasn't just about who owned the cabin today. It was about who had quietly secured tomorrow. And as the clock ticked louder in the silence, Mark's words hung in the air like smoke. "You're playing checkers." "I'm playing chess." The week after that confrontation felt like living under siege. My phone filled with messages not just from my parents, but from extended relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Cousins parroting the same script. "Laura, don't let one house ruin the family. Think of Rachel's future kids. Grandpa would want harmony." It was like a coordinated campaign, and I knew exactly who the campaign manager was. Mark. He had that smooth way of making people believe he was the visionary, the problem solver. But I also knew people like him leave trails, and I was determined to find them. I drove to the county clerk's office on a rainy Thursday, the kind of day where the sky looks bruised and the streets shine with reflections. The clerk, a woman with tired eyes and a name badge that read Janice, pulled up the public filings. And there it was. Mark had already filed a notice of intent to purchase for the Lakewood cabin, dated the day after Grandpa's funeral. My hands clenched into fists. He hadn't even waited for the will to be read. Alongside it was a preliminary contract drafted between Rachel and Mark's LLC, listing the cabin as a pending asset to be leveraged for a construction loan. They were planning to use my inheritance as collateral before it was even legally theirs. The betrayal burned deeper than any words my parents had thrown at me. I printed copies, slid them into a folder, and drove straight to my attorney's office. Mr. Collins, a silver-haired man who'd known Grandpa, read the papers and let out a low whistle. "This isn't just pushy," he said. "This borders on fraudulent misrepresentation. They tried to claim an interest they didn't have. He advised me to hold the information close, use it when the pressure peaked. And peak it did. By Sunday, my parents had called a family meeting at the cabin itself. When I arrived, half the neighborhood seemed to be there, like spectators at a trial. My mother was crying before I even stepped onto the porch, Dad barking about how stubbornness was destroying everything, Rachel wringing her hands, and Mark standing center stage like a ringmaster. He started with his usual charm. "We all want what's best here," he said smoothly. "Laura, no one is against you, but the logical step is to put this property into capable hands, ours, and let it create value instead of sitting idle." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. I let him talk, let him spin his narrative, until the moment he produced a copy of his filing like it was a trump card. "See," he announced, "we've already laid groundwork. The process is in motion. It's easier if Laura just cooperates." Gasps rose from the onlookers, my parents nodding vigorously. That's when I stepped forward and laid my own folder on the coffee table. The leaseback agreement, the right of first refusal, and, most importantly, the certified copies of his premature filings, complete with timestamps proving he had tried to seize control before the estate was settled. "Funny thing about public records," I said, my voice steady despite the hammering in my chest. "They're available to everyone, which means everyone here can see exactly how long Mark has been planning this little flip." I held up the document. "Filed the day after Grandpa's funeral, before the will was read, before I was even officially owner." The room shifted. Neighbors muttered, some in disgust, others in disbelief. Rachel's face went pale, her eyes darting to her husband. Mom sputtered about misunderstandings. Dad shouted about family privacy, but the damage was done. The crowd had seen the receipts. Mark tried to recover, slick as ever. "This is standard practice," he insisted. "A placeholder, nothing more. It doesn't change the bigger picture." But the smirk was gone. His voice carried an edge, brittle where it used to be smooth. And that's when I played my next card. "You're right about one thing," I said. "It doesn't change the bigger picture, because in addition to the leaseback and the ROFR, there's one more clause you don't know about. One that ensures no speculative developer, no LLC, no opportunist can touch this cabin. Not now, not 5 years from now, without facing consequences." I didn't say what it was yet. I let the words hang, let the suspense settle into the air like thick fog. Mark's jaw tightened. My parents stared, confused. Rachel whispered my name again, but I didn't look at her. Because in that moment, I had everyone exactly where I wanted them, waiting, wondering, realizing that for once, I wasn't the daughter they could corner. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, waiting for me to flinch, waiting for me to back down the way I had 1,000 times before. But that day, something inside me had hardened, a steel spine forged from years of being overlooked. I tapped the folder once, deliberately, and said, "Grandpa wasn't just sentimental, he was practical. Before he passed, he asked me to meet with his attorney, and together we added a protective covenant to this property. It's now under a historic preservation easement. That means even if someone tried to bulldoze it for condos, even if someone dangled millions, the cabin cannot be demolished or repurposed without approval from the historical trust." And guess who holds the trust's voting seat? Me. A ripple went through the room, a collective gasp followed by murmurs that sounded more like a jury turning against the accused. Mark's face tightened, the mask slipping, revealing the raw anger underneath. He lunged toward the papers as if grabbing them would erase the ink, but I pulled them back and stood tall. "So you see," I continued, "this isn't just stubbornness. It's law. It's protection. It's Grandpa's way of making sure this house stays in the hands of someone who actually loved it, not someone who saw it as a spreadsheet." My parents sputtered, first with denial, then with desperation. "Laura, you didn't tell us," Mom began, but I cut her off. "Neither did you when you dragged a realtor into my dining room, when you threatened to cut me off, when you tried to sell my life out from under me." Dad's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. Rachel, pale and trembling, whispered, "Mark, tell me this isn't true." But Mark said nothing. He just stared at me, a storm behind his eyes, realizing he'd been outplayed by the daughter he thought was easy prey. The silence stretched until even the neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Mark grabbed his briefcase, muttered something about wasted time, and stormed out the door. Rachel followed, torn between fury and humiliation, throwing me a look that carried both betrayal and something almost like envy. My parents sat stunned, the weight of public shame settling heavier than any lecture I could have given. I gathered the papers, slid them back into my folder, and said quietly, "You wanted to disown me if I didn't comply. Well, maybe it's time I disown the idea that your approval defines me." And with that, I walked out into the crisp evening air, the lake glinting in the distance like a silent witness. Days turned into weeks, and the storm quieted. The texts slowed, the phone calls dwindled, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't drowning under the noise of trying to earn their love. The cabin became my sanctuary again. I spent weekends sanding the deck, repainting the shutters, and sitting on the porch swing with a cup of coffee, breathing in the scent of cedar and freedom. Neighbors who had witnessed the showdown would wave, some even stopping by to tell me they admired my courage. One elderly woman squeezed my hand and said, "Your grandpa would be proud." I think she was right. But pride wasn't the only thing I felt. There was grief too. Grief for the family I'd wanted but never had. Grief for the years wasted chasing validation that was never coming. Yet there was peace in that grief. A quiet acceptance that my worth wasn't up for negotiation anymore. I wasn't the servant daughter. I wasn't the fallback. I was Laura Bennett, the woman who stood her ground when everyone expected her to cave. And maybe that's the real inheritance Grandpa left me. Not just a cabin by the lake, but the courage to guard it, to guard myself. So here's my question to you, watching this right now. If your family asked you to sacrifice the one thing that symbolized your independence, would you give in for peace? Or would you fight for it like I did? Because the truth is, sometimes family isn't about blood, it's about boundaries. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say no, even when the people asking share your last name.